I want to thank my good friend Mortis Media and wish his family and all of you a Merry Christmas. After you're done watching this video, please use the card above or with the links at the end of the story to watch the rest of our collaboration on his channel. Merry Christmas. Number 1. Creepy Christmas Eve. I can't really explain to you how weird this story is, and it just happened very recently. Christmas Eve, in fact. I wanted to write it down while it was fresh in my mind, and I was hoping that you will be able to get it into a video soon. It was warm outside. We have had a few cold days here and there, but the temperature was in the 60s. But interesting enough, the wind was blowing, and it was blowing hard. I checked on my phone, and it was like blowing 20 miles per hour. I had been at my mom's house for Christmas Eve. We were having a great time, and then my mom was driving us home. We got a little freaked out when the oil light came on in the car, and we had to pull over to the side of the road. While my mother called my stepdad, I was looking out the window, and I noticed this weird thing. I included the video of it in this message to you. I'm sure it's just something normal, but I couldn't make out what was going on. I'm just telling you some weird things that we saw that night. We're not really to the part where the really scary thing happened, though. But this was not the last of the weird things. Now we have an next-door neighbor who we are positive has some sort of illegal business going on. I'm not really sure what it is. I think she's either a hooker or a drug dealer. I swear to God, I see all kinds of vehicles outside her place, and all of it happens to be a very little, old dilapidated single-wide trailer. All sorts of weird people go there, and I've counted over 100 unique cars that have been in her driveway at one point or another. Well, me and my 2 housemates were sitting on the porch. It was pretty late at night on Christmas Eve. I was the only one of us that was facing the neighbor's trailer, however. There were 2 trucks in the driveway and people sitting there in both trucks. Now you know at first, despite the suspicion that I had about my neighbor, I wasn't giving this much thought really. It wasn't unusual. However, with the longer and longer amount of time that was passing, and these trucks just kept sitting there in the driveway, the more and more I became suspicious that something was going on. Then I began wondering if it had something to do with us. I mean, think about it. Whatever my neighbor was up to, I was sure it was illegal in some way. It wasn't completely weird to us. Our neighbor across the street was a known drug dealer. His sister lived on the same block, and she was a drug dealer. A previous tenant of that very trailer was a drug dealer. It's just the neighborhood we lived in. But what started bugging me was the idea that maybe these 2 guys were sitting in their trucks waiting for us to go back inside our house. I mean, who wants to do something illegal while 3 people are out on a porch watching them? After a good hour of this, the 2 of them got out of their trucks. I watched one guy, and in the light I could tell he was leaning on a cane. He walked very awkwardly, almost having difficulty holding himself up. It reminded me of the movie Jeepers Creepers. There was a scene after the creeper was badly injured, and he was walking, hobbling along very difficultly to the police station. By overhearing a couple words of his talk with the guy from the other truck, he hobbled this way because he had a wooden leg. They then talked for a while, and I heard some words, and there were some looks at us over on the porch. I truly got the impression that they wanted us to go in our house, or something, but I couldn't do it at that point. We were too close to them to really talk without being heard, so I kept trying to silently communicate with my friends. After what seemed like forever, the 2 of them got back in their trucks and played a game of musical cars. The truck that had been in the front drove off, while the guy with the wooden leg hobbled up to the door of the trailer, which opened to let him in. And this was just a very weird and creepy thing. I was thinking how they'd just been sitting out there for at least an hour. The lady who rented the trailer had never come out. I knew they had been talking about us, and I just asked my housemates how much weirder this Christmas Eve could get. "Didn't you hear the neighbors across the street arguing?" one of them asked me. I admitted that I did not. I was paying way too close attention to the people in the house next to me. Apparently, our neighbors across the street had been arguing pretty loud, though. By now it was past midnight, and it was Christmas Day. I guess they hadn't gotten a Christmas tree, and the man and woman who lived there, the other drug dealers, had been fighting loudly about it. And then they were quiet. And then we heard something that no one expects to hear on Christmas morning. A chainsaw. All three of us looked at each other, stunned, but we were able to put some sense into it. There were trees behind those houses, and we figured the man had gone out, and he had tried to cut down a Christmas tree. And that was when our Christmas took another turn. We could hear some yelling and screaming. They were closer to the house again. We really couldn't make out what we were hearing, until we heard a loud scream of, "Shut the fuck up, or you're going to be the Christmas tree." We then heard the chainsaw throttle, and a scream from the woman back in that area. At first we panicked, thinking that the woman was going to get killed. I mean, those two fought all the time, and people were used to it, but threatening her with the chainsaw was new. There was some commotion, though, and then the chainsaw went silent. We didn't know what was going on until we heard him demanding her to open the door. We figured out that she must have run from him into the house. The chainsaw was no longer giving us any scary noises. This was just some of the normal fighting and yelling that went on between the two of them, and eventually the voices died down. The lights came on in their living room, and we just assumed things were back to normal. It was a weird Christmas Eve indeed. We almost got stranded on the side of the road, saw this weird thing we couldn't explain, had the weird feeling we were preventing a drug deal from going on, and heard our neighbor threaten his girlfriend with a chainsaw. At that point, we decided to go in and watch Christmas movies. It was just too much like Halloween outside.
Number 2. Mall Santa. Christmas is not supposed to be a scary time. Even with scary Christmas movies and stuff, it's not a scary time. However, one of the scariest things in my life happened during the Christmas season. The Woodfield Mall in Schaumburg, Illinois, is the major mall in the area. They have a great Christmas decoration theme, and it's absolutely beautiful, and I loved one thing more than anything else: sitting on Santa's lap and telling him what I wanted for Christmas. This story is short, but it is terrorizing. I was likely about 10 years old at the time. I was very happy, even though the line was very, very long to go see him, but I was still looking forward to it. This was the first year that Furbies were very popular, and it was nigh impossible to get one. I don't know the last time that toy was so popular, but I knew it was this time, and I wanted one more than anything else. Here's what happened. After waiting nearly 2 hours in line, I finally got to sit on Santa's lap. I've already mentioned how much I like doing this, so I was pretty excited. He asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and so I said, the Furby. And then he asked me if I had been a good boy all year or if I had been naughty. Well, I had to be honest. I was 10 years old. Of course I was naughty now and then, so I told him that I had been naughty occasionally, but that I really regretted it and promised I would be a good boy from now on. At this point, Santa then tightened his grip on my arm. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered to me, "I kill naughty boys on Christmas Eve." I'm sure no one else would have heard what he said, but when he told me, my whole body went numb. It was like my whole body got fuzzy or something. It was the single most terrorizing moment of my life. I couldn't imagine why he would say something like that to me, and I couldn't respond. My mum came, and got me after they took my picture and gave me a candy cane, but I couldn't get that awful comment and threat out of my mind. I mean, I wasn't stupid. I knew he wasn't the real Santa, but I was still at the age where I believed he existed and that the mall ones were probably his helpers. I was shaken to my core. I kind of felt funny and weird for the rest of the shopping trip. I didn't tell my parents about it. I was still young enough to think that getting a threat like that would be worse if I shared it with anyone, like he would know about it. I started fearing Christmas Eve, and when it eventually came, I remember my mum coming up after I went to bed. I was unable to sleep. It was very, very quiet in the house, and I just laid there in bed, eyes wide open, scared and wondering what to expect. I can't explain to you how creepy it was. I still believed in Santa, and I was honest to the mall one. As my eyes began to get heavy, and I began falling asleep, mostly against my will, the fear was gripping me. I couldn't be aware if someone showed up and tried to hurt me. I was young. Eventually, sleep took me, but I couldn't get the idea of being punished out of my mind, not even the following morning when I was tired and confused. But I kept everything to myself and opened my presents. I was scared though, scared for a long time about what Santa had said to me. Even today, it still haunts me a little.
Number 3, the worst Christmas. My dad was always doing some pretty bad things after my mother passed away. You know, I could understand being depressed and stuff, but he did have 4 kids to raise still. Instead, he lost himself in a bottle and never found his way out. The worst Christmas I ever had was when I was about 13 years old. This was back in the late 80s. Almost 2 weeks before Christmas, Dad took us all to the store, gave us $25 apiece, and told us to buy our own Christmas presents. We did, and then we went home and wrapped our own Christmas presents. I can tell you without doubt that none of us believed in Kris Kringle anymore that year. Knowing what our presents were, none of us were eager to get out of bed and open gifts in the morning, so we figured we would sleep in until we were ready to get up. 4 loud, deafening gunshots in my bedroom not only woke me up, but caused me to pee the bed for the first time since I was like 4. My brother and I had shared that room, and we both woke up in shock. My dad, who was probably up all night and staggeringly drunk, was in the room and holding a gun. He had shot it at the ceiling 4 times. "Get your asses up already and open your fucking gifts," he told us. I really wanted to clean up first, but he wouldn't let me. I had to join my brother and sisters and peed in pajamas, opening presents before he let me change. He sat there with his gun the entire time. Fortunately, we didn't live with him much longer. One of our aunts took us in. I don't know what happened to him. Whether he's alive or dead or what, he just disappeared from our lives. I don't really miss him.
Number 4. When did you stop believing in Santa Claus? That's something most of us are asked multiple times as adults, and while most of the ensuing stories I've heard are tales of wishes left unfulfilled, my own story is a bit different. I was 6. My parents had recently got divorced, and my brothers and I were staying with my father. For some reason on Christmas Eve, he always had us sleep in the same room. Maybe it was just easier for him to keep track of us, I'm not sure, but whatever the reason, we did. My brothers were both older than me, and already knew the truth. While some older siblings are content to let the younger ones continue to believe, my eldest brother was not. At least, not when I spotted a red star as I looked out the window and excitedly told him it was Rudolph. Annoyed, he shouted at me, "There is no Santa, now go to sleep," and pulled the blankets over his head. I was used to this attitude and just shrugged his words off, but I did settle down in bed and try to sleep. I remember laying there and staring out at the window as my brother drifted off to sleep. I'm not sure how much time went by, or even if I drifted off to sleep myself, but I do remember seeing a shadow pass in front of the window. We were on the second floor, and immediately I knew that the shadow I had seen was one of the skis on Santa's sleigh. Excitedly, I immediately shook my brother awake to tell him I had just seen Santa's sleigh, but he just told me to shut up and went back to sleep with, "There is no Santa." I tried to wake my other brother up, but was told to go back to sleep or that I would not be receiving any presents. Annoyed, I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers back up, but I couldn't sleep. My eldest brother was snoring too loud, and I couldn't get out of my head that I had just seen Santa's sleigh. Had he already stopped at our house? Were the presents downstairs waiting to be opened? I listened for a moment and realized that both of my brothers were asleep, so I slipped out of bed. I wanted to take a peek and see if Santa had come or not. What if he skipped our house because I was awake? Maybe that's why I saw him pass by the window. Worried, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed barefoot to the door. I opened it and looked out along the dark hallway. We were on the opposite side of the hallway from the stairs, and I was going to have to pass the doors to the empty rooms my brother and I would have to be sleeping in on other nights. There was also the bathroom, and all of the doors were open. I was always easily frightened of the idea of passing these open doors in the darkness. It filled me with dread, but there was a glow coming from the bottom of the stairs. The Christmas tree was lit, and I thought about the presents again. I had to do it. Besides, they were just our bedrooms. There would be nothing scary there. I slipped from my brother's room and walked down the hallway, creeping slowly, acutely aware of the darkness and the empty space beyond the other doors. Space where anything could be hiding and waiting to jump out at a little girl who was out past her bedtime. But I kept on moving towards that glow. Then I heard a noise. A thunk like someone had knocked over a small object, but something heavy. It didn't break, just thunked. I paused. Normally my mind would have created all kinds of horrible monsters this could have been, but on this night in particular my mind came up with only one possibility: Santa Claus. He hadn't skipped our house because I wasn't asleep. He was right here, right now. Perhaps I should have run and gone back to sleep then. I could have woken up to presents and know that he hadn't skipped us, but like any child would be, I was suddenly hit with the need to see him for myself. Finally, I could prove to my big brother that he was wrong the whole time. Santa was real, and he was downstairs right now. I crept forward, getting ever closer to the stairs. I was no longer worried about the dark, as my mind was focused on only seeing Santa. I reached the stairs, grabbed the railing, and took a deep breath. Slowly I descended, one step at a time, each step bringing me closer to the spot where I would be able to see down into our living room. There had been other noises since the thunk, rustling noises, grunts, knocks, and a clink. In my head, I heard it was Santa putting the presents out. And then I heard my father's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but another voice, a louder and clearer voice, answered him. "Shut up, you drunk idiot." It was a man's voice and not one I was familiar with. Certainly Santa wouldn't speak to someone like that, even my dad, who was drunk very often. I took another step down and was closer to where I could see into the living room. I could see a man in red, but it didn't look like Santa. I took another step and crouched down to fully see into the room through the stair railing. He was a large man I didn't know. He wasn't dressed as Santa, just had a big red shirt on. Beyond him, I saw my father with his head down on the dining room table. The man I didn't know was going through the small pile of presents under the tree, ripping them open. He was stealing our presents. Without thinking, I stood on the stairs and shouted, "Hey, those are ours!" The man turned in surprise. His grubby face was partially hidden by a gnarled black beard, and he glared at me. "Mine now, you little turd," he growled. "You've been a bad girl, and Santa's taken 'em back." I wasn't stupid. I knew this wasn't Santa Claus, but it was Christmas Eve, and if Santa knew everything, then he had to be knowing this was happening right now. He had to be able to stop it. I turned to run back up the stairs, but before I could, the strange man had reached through the railing and grabbed my leg. He yanked and I fell back on the stairs, knocking the wind out of me. He pulled my leg through the railing and twisted it. I tried to scream, but the air hadn't fully come back to my lungs yet. The feeling of having the wind knocked out of me scared me so much that I couldn't breathe, and this guy was going to break my leg. I wanted to cry for my big brother, but I couldn't. As much as he bullied me, I knew he'd protect me, but the air wouldn't seem to return to my lungs. "You tell anyone, and I'll come back and snap this leg of yours off." Suddenly there was a loud bang, and some plaster flew in the air. The man let go of my leg, and I finally got the air back enough to scream. I screamed my big brother's name, but it didn't matter. The gunshot woke all of them up. The man swung around and looked at my father, who was standing there very unsteadied by the table with a gun in hand. He often had it with him when he got drunk, but I'd never seen him actually use it. "You drunk piece of crap can't even aim," the man said. But he had let go of me now and dropped whatever present he had also been holding. Before I knew what else was happening, my big brother had picked me up and ran back up the stairs. There were lots of questions about what I was doing and what I had seen. I sat on the bed and answered them, then heard nothing else from downstairs until the police showed up. I don't know if Dad called them or the neighbor did. I don't know if that guy was caught or if he ran. Honestly, I don't even remember Christmas the next morning. I just remember thinking that if Santa was real, he'd have really seen this, and his sleigh would have stopped that guy from hunting me on Christmas Eve. That was the day I stopped believing.
Number 5. My mother's Christmas gift. When my mother became a single parent, I was 14 at the time, and the 5th child of 7 siblings. I had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, juvenile diabetes, 5 years earlier. I was on a steady regimen of insulin injections and a rigidly controlled diet. I was exclusively under my mother's care, but especially after she divorced the old man for irreconcilable differences. The old man is what we called him after he proved to all of us that he was no longer our dad. But that's another story. We moved from Memphis, Tennessee to Little Rock, Arkansas. Our only brother had already married and decided to stay behind. Because our remaining household was all girls, my mother was exceptionally careful to see not only to our health and well-being, but to our personal protection and safety as well. She taught us to defend ourselves, and protection and safety as well. She taught us to defend ourselves and take nothing from anyone we didn't know, while at the same time always showing respect and kindness to everyone that deserved it. We learned to understand the innate danger of being a female in the world. We never walked alone, and with only each other. My mother was tough, young, beautiful, experienced, and above all, nobody's fool. She taught us the same, which we all took to heart. My mother took me everywhere she went, and because she happened to be friends with the manager of a convenience store where she worked at the time, I was allowed to stay in the store while my mother worked. Liability was less of an issue then. Naturally, I helped her in any way I could, especially when she was busy with customers. I got paid in little items I asked her to get for me that I couldn't get on my own. My mother and I loved singing Christmas carols, but what the owners passed for Christmas music, the same 10 songs, personally sung by members of their own family, over and over again for 8 hours, hung over our heads like a noxious gas, but for the ears. It drove both of us completely insane. Tim Burton and Johnny Depp could have included it in Nightmare Before Christmas or Sweeney Todd. I remember one particularly cold and windy day in early winter. Light snow had just started to fall. I was riding with her to work and watching the snow hitting the windshield and blowing and swirling little eddies. It would dance intermittently and then blow off and away like magic fairy dust. Still, I have never liked the cold, even though I love the outdoors, and found myself, more than once, whimsically wanting to know what it would be like to be inside a single crystal snowflake. Even I knew in my agile young mind that this was not possible. Not so much, I logically reasoned, because of the impossibly cramped space, as the enveloping and pervasive cold. I rolled down the passenger side window and stuck my head out, trying to catch just one snowflake, which proved impossible, thereby proving my point. After I began to get shivery, I pulled my head back in, just as we reached the store. After getting out of the car, we noticed for the very first time, like ever, it was snowing on Christmas Eve. There were visible drifts of snow in certain areas around the parking lot. My mother grabbed a handful and tossed them at me. I squealed, "Good one." In turn, I grabbed a bunch with one hand while protecting the one gift we were allowed to open every year on Christmas Eve. Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators, Secret of Phantom Lake, Book 19. I had already read all the other books up to that point in the series, and eventually got them all. Remembering not to hit her around the head area, I decided to fling the snow all down the front of her coat. She laughed her little girl laugh and yelled, "Kathy, don't you hit me in the face now," and her half-hearted order to stop. Just as she got to the door, however, I let go of a last parting shot and hit her square in the butt. The single, glancing note that issued from her perfect throat would have broken glass had it not been shatterproof, like, say, the windows of the convenience store. "You better stop that, or I'll spank your little behindy, honey," and then fled into the store with me, right behind her. It was so cold out there, I told myself, I was afraid I might start growing snotsicles. I remembered hearing once that some people didn't like snow in the forecast. To me, it was cheery and magical, cold, but beautiful. With Thanksgiving over and Christmas Eve arrived, we had redecorated the store for the holidays. It was one of a chain of magic markets that were locally owned. Mike, our resident store manager and close gay family friend, was particularly cheerful because my mother and I had won the contest for the best decorated store. He was particularly proud of that. My mother and I won $100 for that. The only problem ever mentioned about the store was just that the owner's supposedly festive, piped-in holiday music was positively unbearable. Mike mused sarcastically that it was because the owners had sung and recorded 10 of their favorite songs as a way of including all the staff in their personal holiday cheer. Too bad that didn't include a free turkey or some wild turkey to really celebrate or, as it were, drown our sorrows. Of course I didn't drink alcohol at that age. Mike used to joke that their version of cheerful holiday music was enough to gag a maggot. As the afternoon drew on, I noticed that one of the coolers was down, so Mike called a repairman to fix it. While the repairman was in the back, I was in the front, helping my mother stock shelves. She spent most of her time at the cash register helping the customers. I remember how she had this way of pinning her long raven black hair above and behind each ear, to not have to fuss about her hair and her eyes when she was working. I'll never forget how, during the summer months, the sun would highlight her full, rich, thick black hair. so black it was practically blue. Her hair and her looks were the envy of most of the female customers, and some of the males that came into the store, both young and old. I, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Long, straight, blonde hair. To my discerningly independent mind, I didn't like it. I wasn't like hers. I noticed the repairman walk by in his one-piece forest green coveralls with the long sleeves that almost covered his hands. I must have been reading far too many detective stories back then. I always had a good eye for observing the world around me, though, especially strangers. I think I got it from my grandmother. I remember watching him as he crept across the floor, hesitating momentarily, as though he'd forgotten something, and then deciding against it. I had this creepy feeling, like the feeling you get when somebody's watching you, that he wanted to turn around and look at me one last time before he shuffled out the front door and away into the darkening night. And that irked me. I was about to tell my mother about him when the box of cat food I was pricing slipped out of my hand and almost fell to the floor. The thought flew out of my mind and was instantly replaced with what I wanted to get as a little something extra for our 4 cats for Christmas. We had a long-haired, black and white male tuxedo cat named Boots, so naturally when we got a silver point Siamese cat with blue crossed eyes, we named her Slippers. And her twin sister, Samantha, who was also a silver point female Siamese with blue eyes. And finally my own chocolate cream tortoiseshell cat named Shiloh, one of Samantha's kittens. Yes, the self-same cat of Shiloh and the Shadow of Sound. Scary story. I took several cans of cat food, along with some fuzzy catnip mouse toys for the fuzz buckets, over to my mother after calling out to her, across the aisle and over the den, if it was okay. Of course it is, honey, she half distractedly called back. I placed them on the counter in front of her, and then went back to finish up some of the pricing. I remember standing towards the back, furthest from the front doors while facing them, when the door chime sounded, alerting us that there were customers that needed to be greeted and sold to if necessary. I remember the relief we would feel when that awfully cheery holiday music, and I do mean awfully, was blissfully interrupted whenever the door chime sounded. Our sanity would return, even if only momentarily. We plotted desperately about leaving the door open just to cut out the horrid music. But then we thought better on it if the music was only going to be replaced with the incessant door chimes or the sub-freezing cold. When I looked up, I recognized one of the men. It was the cooler repairman with the oversized coveralls. What was odd about him this time was that he was with another guy who was wearing the same forest green long-sleeve coveralls that actually fit. I had all but completely forgotten about him up until he came back through the front door, accompanied by his much larger Carnival Funhouse mirror twin. I tilted my head to the side, reacting involuntarily to the coinkydink of it, and after looking at my mother, who was still too busy to bother at the time, sighing, I resumed stacking the cat food cans on the top shelf, facing out towards the customer. Finishing one shelf, I noticed the picture of the still famous orange tabby cat named Mortis on the front of a can. Aside, had it been today, I would have found myself thinking of somebody by the name of Killer Orange Cat and his mascot Ichigo? Maybe? But I digress. Then I heard a loud, clear male voice order my mother to give me the money. My head jerked up to see a man with a pistol placed right between my mother's eyes. I found myself unable to move. I was literally paralyzed, frozen to the spot. Transfixed, stuck. I watched helplessly as my mother reached under the counter where the paper bags were kept and slapped a small brown paper sack on the counter. Calmly and concisely, the man with the pistol resumed, "All of it. Now." Then she emptied the cash register, with what was still left, that she was supposed to put in the floor safe, but she hadn't got around to it yet. Putting cash in the floor safe was a store policy when the money in the cash register exceeded a certain amount. My mother's personal routine was to take any money that exceeded that amount and put it in a small paper sack under the counter to be added to the floor safe later, especially when she had too many customers or was simply too busy at the time. When the man with the pistol came in, along with his crony, and ordered her to hand it over, now, she had reflexively smacked the sack full of money on the counter as well. Normally she would never let the amount in the sack exceed about $50, but because we had been so busy, it was about 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the amount that had steadily grown up to about $350. Watching the whole thing play out, like some live Christmas morality play from further back in the store, I discovered that I was somehow superglued to the spot. It wasn't so much that I dared not move as I was incapable of moving, while I just stood there like a dork, playing the part of the convenience store mannequin. My mother, as usual, handled it with the utmost grace and dignity. I kept thinking over and over that if only I could move, I might be able to help her. Then I heard the man with the gun repeat again, but this time louder, "All of it." The other man, the unkempt repairman, who was standing behind her, started to move towards me. Her dark brown eyes flicked in my direction, the fucking gun unmoving at her forehead. I thought again that I'd gotta do something. I was too scared out of my wits, but growing angry by the second. I hated the way I felt and fought back tears. When the other man started moving towards me, my mother bellowed out, in as unholy a voice as I had never heard before, one single, terrifyingly enunciated word. "No!" It was the most guttural, animal, otherworldly sound I had ever heard. It was more like a command than a plea. It was both menacing and wicked. I knew only too well what it meant. The man, who was moving towards me, obeyed immediately, as though he had run against an invisible wall. She had stopped him blind. Then I heard a loud crack like thunder. A shockingly loud noise I will never forget. The most evil, ugly, and awful sound. 1 second I had been watching the man approach me, but now he seemed to be moving in slow motion. In reality, he had darted swiftly back to where my mother had been only moments before, but had disappeared. I remember them looking at each other, wondering where she could have gone, but in slow motion. Somehow I was seeing them moving really slow, as though they were being pushed back by a current of air and water. I too tried to move, but discovered that I was still unable to move a muscle. I couldn't even tell if I was still breathing. It felt like I later learned about sleep paralysis. I was completely aware of everything around me, but I was simply incapable of movement. It was terrifying. It was all happening too fast, I told myself at the time. My mind was simply incapable of processing what was going on. I wasn't shot, I reassured myself. I was in shock. The entire scene up to that point played and replayed over and over, and repeated itself again and again in my mind. It was all as though I saw it, but did not see it, while at the same time seeing it. Now I could not unsee it. I blinked. That simple reflex was the first sign my body had begun to wake up. I might actually move yet, I told myself. It felt like hours since the robber fired his gun into the ceiling, but I knew it could not have been more than a few seconds. When I realized I could no longer see my mother, I feared for the worst. Nonetheless, I forced myself to watch where the two men were going. They were moving swiftly now towards the front door. I saw when the gun-wielding fuck gestured for Tweedledee and his dumb self to get the hell out of there. I felt the air become thick as a smaller one with the oversized clothes passed me and leered back one last time before he too went out the front door. With the clarity of a snowball hitting me in the back of the head, I realized my mother had screamed the way she did. The other one, the sick one, he had been coming for me. After what seemed like, and very nearly turned into, an eternity of silence for both of us, the electronic door chime sounded one last time as they scurried out of the store. Other than the ringing in my ears and my desperate gasp for breath, I slowly began to break free from my paralysis. Trying to remain calm, I laughed to myself that the only good thing that came out of all of this was that the gunman fired into the ceiling. He somehow managed to kill one of the owner's demented, notoriously off-key renditions of one of the most beloved Christmas songs, Silent Night. The owner's solo rendered it into more of a bearing of the cross than a celebration of the spirit of Christmas or the birth of Jesus Christ. I thanked my God and silently thanked my mother that the mind-numbing music had ceased. I remembered that even in the worst situations, there were always things to be thankful for. This was the first cause for celebration along this curiously weird and terrifying Christmas holiday. The felonious twins would have been long gone into the blue onyx night sky had it not been for the real cooler repairman standing at a payphone outside in the parking lot, and nothing but his long underwear and socks. They had little Santas all over them. He was standing in ankle-deep snow calling the police. The two robbers tied him up and stuck him in the back of his van and took both pairs of his forest green coveralls as a disguise, which, as Christmas gifts go, only proved the worse for the short, lustful little robber fuck. What gave him away was his coveralls proved to be way too big for his height and weight, and made him look more like a little kid trying to wear his dad's work clothes than a serious felon. I could only imagine what had happened when he had been packing a gun as well. The second cause for celebration was when I finally got complete control of myself, after I felt a warm, soft, and familiar hand touch my ankle, and then two strong arms climbing up to me, and finally wrapping herself around me, holding me and gently rocking me awake. My eyes filled with tears that were wanting to spill out, but I still couldn't let them. Turning around, I looked directly into the large brown eyes of the only woman I had ever loved in this life, my mother. I had never experienced such clarity of purpose in my too young life before. "You're all right," I spoke, finally. "She's all right," I thought silently. What had happened after the shot was my mother had dropped instantly, reflexively, down to below the counter, and began working her way towards where I was standing, unable to move. That was the Cherokee on her father, my grandfather's side, quick, fast, and sure. I understood by and by that the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to her, apart from losing her own life, had nearly happened to me. Something so unfathomable, unthinkable, and yet she and I were still alive and unhurt, at least physically. But by this grace of God, faith in Christ, and my indomitably willed mother, we would never have made it. That was the third cause for celebration that Christmas Eve. The dynamic duds had gotten away with about $95 from the cash register, but had left behind the tiny brown paper sack my mother had loudly and defiantly slapped down on the counter when they first ordered her to "Give me the money." There was about $350 worth of 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s they didn't know about at the time. I'd like to think they found out later. The police caught the twin disasters just outside the store. The gunman, the apparent leader of the group, had seen movement at one of the payphones and decided it was time to make their escape. He must have thought that nobody knew about the robbery yet, or maybe they really had been moving in slow motion. Fortunately, my mother had a few friends in the police department too, so when they got the call from the real cooler repairman, the police staked out the area, and as soon as they came out of the store, they were quickly greeted and arrested. Fortunately, they hadn't thought to take hostages. My mother's "no" must have put that thought out of their mind. She probably would have killed them both had they tried. Not long after, my mother quit that job and found another with me, again in tow, by her side. For months after, the whole thing kept replaying itself over and over in my head. I felt guilty for not being able to do anything to help. I had frozen either in fear or in shock, or both. As it had turned out, my mother assured me that it was exactly what I should have done. I was, after all, only about 14 at the time. This wasn't some Christmas play. This was real life. My mother, God willing, Christ, and myself had all played a part in a very real-life drama that could have turned into a real-life tragedy. And when you think about it, everything that could have happened to avoid a double homicide, kidnapping, or worse did happen. I'll never forget that my mother's Christmas gift turned out to be the best gift I could never have imagined getting. Her love for me, along with God's protection, made this the best and final reason to celebrate the Christmas holiday. Note: this story is dedicated to the store manager mentioned in a previous story for KOC as Thomas, but due to his current decease, I felt it incumbent upon me, in my love and friendship, to give him his actual first name, Mike, in the story. Here's to you, Mike. May the owner's personal cheer not follow you into the next life. Love and miss you, old friend. I want to thank Mortis Media, a really good friend of mine, for continuing this tradition of Christmas stories with me. He has kept doing this for years, despite knowing that working with me is a pain in the ass. Merry Christmas, Mortis, and thank you very much. Everyone, if you're not subscribed to him, and I'd be surprised if you're not, please head over to his channel, listen to the second half of this collaboration, and subscribe to his channel. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, I hope you'll subscribe and hit that little bell so you can get notified when new videos show up. If you don't celebrate Christmas, I hope you still have a very good weekend and enjoy the stories. And if you do, Merry Christmas. But even on Christmas, there's one thing you can't forget to do. Make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Ho ho ho!